Hello, I'm Nick Spencer, and you're listening to a new series of Reading Our Times, the podcast about books, about ideas about us. This series, we're looking at playing God, science, religion, and the future of humanity. We're going to be talking about scientific immortality, alien life, animal personhood, the rise in mental ill health, and the soul of AI. And underlying it all, we're going to be thinking about the question that lies at the heart of Reading Our Times. How are we to understand our human condition?
When you think about the debate between science and religion, you'd be forgiven for your first thoughts being around issues such as the Big Bang, or dinosaurs, or evolution. You may have bought into the caricature of science and religion as centuries-old adversaries, operating in competing and contradictory realms. But perhaps instead, science and religion are often engaging in overlapping magisteria. They're often talking about the same things, or at least engaging in similar questions. Or maybe really it's just one ultimate question. What does it mean to be human? And this is where the conversation about science and religion gets much more interesting, in exploring these questions of human personhood, dignity, identity and value that are more pressing today than they've ever been. I'm Chine McDonald and I'm director of the think tank Theos. And according to my colleague Dr. Nick Spencer, your usual host, who I'm turning the tables on in this episode, it's in exploring the nature and status of the human that science and religion are most entangled. He and our former Theos colleague Dr. Hannah Waite have written Playing God: Science, Religion and the Future of Humanity, a new book exploring some of the biggest questions of our time. Will AI replace us? Could science help us live forever? What's with anti-vaxxers? Oh, and what would alien life mean for humanity? I'm looking forward to exploring all of this and more with Nick. Nick, welcome to Reading Our Times, a podcast I think you're familiar with.
I never miss an episode, Ginny.
Great. Well, first up, listeners may be familiar with your last book, Magisteria. Can you tell us about the journey from that book to Playing God? What's this one attempting to do?
Well, Playing God isn't a sequel, but you'd be forgiven for thinking it might be. Magisteria was a history of the entangled relationship between science and religion, beginning in the classical world, going right through Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, Victorian battles, 20th century. But it ends with a short section on AI. The background argument to all of that is that science and religion, broadly speaking, being pretty compatible and pretty friendly through the years. When they've sparked off one another, it tends to have been around questions of how we understand the human, who has a right to adjudicate on that, are our understandings of the human exclusive? Now, that is obviously an issue when it comes to AI, but it's more generally an issue when it comes to science's capacity to manipulate, to understand, to correct, to improve, in inverted commas, the human. And it struck me when it came to the end of Magisteria that actually that's going to be a huge issue in the 21st century. In fact, if anything's going to define the 21st century, it's us elevating some things to the status of personhood and modifying those things we already think as persons into something slightly different, and perhaps even discovering other persons, other life forms out there in the cosmos. So it struck me that actually we could be entering a golden age of fruitful dialogue between science and religion about questions of humanity and personhood if we can get the conversation right.
Well, picking up on the Playing God theme, so when another toddler visits our home, my 2-year-old engages in parallel play. They are both playing in the same room, yes, but they're playing separately. When science and religion are exploring questions around the nature of what it is to be human, are they in effect engaging in parallel play? Or are there places where they really actually engage with each other? Or are there points at which I think in your book it feels like, well, this is where science stops and this is where religion kind of takes over. Do they actually engage with each other, or are they kind of parallel playing?
That's a really good question. I don't think they're quite parallel playing, because that sounds a little bit like Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria. He argued that science deals with facts, religion deals with values, never the twain shall meet. And the argument of Magisteria and the premise of this book is that's not true. They are entangled. Science and religion are entangled. So I think parallel playing wouldn't quite capture it. But at the same time, it's not as if there's an obvious way in which they link. And this is the point where they play together, as it were. One of the metaphors we use at one point in the book is that of cartography. It's actually quite a familiar metaphor in this whole area. It is quite possible to have different maps of exactly the same territory. You can have a hydrological map, a physical map, a political map, a map of communications, walking, ordnance survey, but they can be exactly of the same area. What's going on there is that we are saying there are different ways of framing and understanding this particular territory. I think that's a helpful metaphor when you're talking about human beings. It is perfectly possible, correct and accurate, to map human beings genetically, shall we say, or biologically, or evolutionarily. There are perfectly legitimate, coherent understandings of the human and each of those levels and each of those maps, and certain kind of language and rhetoric comes with each of those levels. They are obviously the territory of science. They are scientific enterprises, but there are other ways of understanding the human. There are social ways, emotional ways, political ways, and spiritual ways, which are more loosely scientific, if you like. And one of the core messages of playing God is it's a mistake to reduce ourselves only to one map, as it were, to say, this is the way of understanding humans. We understand humans as information processing units these days, and really that's the most satisfactory way. Well, it's a satisfactory way, but I don't think it's an exclusive way. And what we're advocating in playing God is recognising and honouring the fact that it is perfectly possible to map, talk about, to understand the human on a range of different levels.
Okay, so I think it seems to me that much of the characterisation of this conflict between science and religion, like the ones that were in the air when I was growing up and kind of studying theology, has been about the origins of the universe. So the big things out there, the kind of cosmology, Big Bang theory, evolution. And what I think your book is trying to say is that where it gets really interesting is when it comes to the things kind of in here, the nature of the human, the closer things. But I guess my question is, hasn't it always really been about the nature of the human? So who we are and whether we matter. What is it about these particular subjects that you've picked to explore in your book that are actually about the human person, and why have you chosen those subjects?
So there's two very good questions wrapped into one there. I am inclined to say that so much of the certainly interesting parts of the historical dialogue between science and religion have been predicated on arguments or disagreements or indeed agreements about the nature of the human. I wouldn't want to say they all have been. There have been times when a scientific and a religious worldview, P.S. I hate those kind of simplistic categories, but we'll ride with them for the time being, have claimed different things about the origin of life or the origin of the universe, and there's been disagreement there. But much of the time, it's been around conceptions of the human. The reason for choosing these particular subjects was that, partly they're the ones you see in the press. They're the ones that are dominating news coverage. I joke about the pet theory that the AI may already have taken over because there are just so many stories about AI. This could all be part of the kind of the AI subterfuge. We kind of think we're in charge, but actually they're running the media agenda. That's the most obvious one. But there is vast amounts of money, billions of dollars being poured into the attempt to extend life and then extend it for a very, very long period of time, and then in some people's vision to upload it and so on and so forth. There are these fascinating court cases taken by the Non-Human Rights Project about trying to get the personhood, the legal personhood of certain non-human animals recognised. So in a sense, these subjects presented themselves. If you're interested in the human, and in particular if you're interested in scientific incursions or conceptions of the human, these are the top subjects you've got to write about.
So you touched on it a little bit there. I wanted to come to this. Tell us about the case of Happy the elephant and what that says about human personhood. What are the issues going on there?
Yes, so let me give you chapter and verse on that one. Happy is a 51-year-old female Asian elephant. She's been a resident in Bronx Zoo for most of her life. By all accounts, she is an impressive animal, sensitive, intelligent, and the first Asian elephant unambiguously to have passed the mirror test. We might come on to what the mirror test is in a minute. Her case was brought by the Non-Human Rights Project, an organisation dedicated, in its own words, to challenging an archaic, unjust legal status quo that views and treats all non-human animals as things with no rights. Now, the argument there is that, in the first instance, what is a legal person? And underneath that argument, what is a person metaphysically speaking? I've got an episode in this new series of Reading Our Times specifically looking at that with an American philosopher. But if non-human animals, like elephants, like chimpanzees, even like cephalopods perhaps, or dolphins, if they tick the boxes that we normally associate with human personhood, so a certain degree of self-consciousness, rationality, other awareness, so on and so forth, then they are metaphysically speaking persons. And if they're metaphysically speaking persons, they should be legally recognised as persons. And if that's the case, a huge amount transpires. Now, the judge in that particular case said, this is above my pay grade. Basically, this is a legitimate and important issue, but you can't decide these issues through the courts. But this issue isn't going to go away. And it is a fascinating exploration of that hinterland of personhood between human persons, and we recognise all humans as persons, although historically we didn't, of course, and non-human animals who certainly exhibit some form of awareness, some form of consciousness, perhaps even some form of moral reflection, certainly deep emotional responses. Well, what exactly is it that then prevents them from qualifying as persons? And concomitantly, what does that mean for our own personhood?
Well, it seems to me that one of the answers that you give around the difference between me and Happy the elephant is that I can talk. I can use language. I know you love books and words and oratory. And I just want to stick with this kind of idea of language for a bit. You write that the differentiator between humans and other species is that humans are capable of generating and participating in new worlds of meaning through language. How does this idea of language come into the conversation about religious ideas and personhood?
So I do think that the kind of language we have, of course, all other animals communicate, and some animals communicate with a great deal of sophistication. There's even evidence that some birds communicate with recursive language, which up until this point we thought was quintessentially human. But humans have a particular sophistication with language, which enables them to engage with inner worlds and imaginatively constructed inner worlds of themselves and others that I think is essential to personhood. And I think there are profound theological ramifications for this, because the idea of creation coming through speech is central to the creation narrative in Genesis. And the idea of new life coming through communication, and particularly the communication of the gospel, is central to the New Testament. That I think from a theological point of view, that idea of communication is central to creation and to our position within creation. And that's why I think there is a kind of quite profound theological angle upon this whole issue. You don't have to be a theologian, you don't have to be a Christian to still believe that language is really important to distinguish between personhood and non-personhood. But I do think it kind of makes sense within a Christian theological framework.
Well, it also seems that language is one of those spaces in this conversation between science and religion in which there is potential slippage between how scientists talk and how theologians talk. Scientists reach for sacred words to describe the awe of scientific wonder. And you write this in relation to genome mapping and gene editing in that chapter. Such is the magnitude of the issue at hand. Our language instinctively drifts away from the sober precision of the scientific paper and reaches for words, images and stories that are saturated with a sense of transcendence and existential significance. What is going on there? Do scientists know they need to reach for these transcendent words in order to underscore the weight of the things that they're uncovering?
I think it is fascinating the way in which, when we talk about issues that we think have existential significance, ethical significance, metaphysical significance, we naturally reach for terms, words, rhetoric that is heavily freighted in this way. This is a random example. I recently read Middlemarch by George Eliot because I was goaded to by a friend of mine who said it's like 100-page of Victorian novel. They're never going to read that. I did. And I think it's superb. I counted up a number of times that she uses the word soul in there. Now, George Eliot, obviously famously an evangelical who lost her faith, not least translating German higher criticism of the Bible in the middle of the 19th century. So she is not a religious believer by any way, shape or form. But she uses the word soul repeatedly. But the way that she uses the word soul there, she's not using it in this Cartesian sense of something that connects with the pineal gland that's in the brain and is immaterial. She uses the word soul to try and intimate the profoundest, deepest, most meaningful, portentous, existentially significant aspect of being human. Now, if you're talking about the human genome, the kind of thing that shapes our physical, emotional, social being in the world, you want some kind of language that carries over the significance of all that. And for better or worse, that is religious language, or at least religiously inflected language. Now, you don't get that in scientific papers, and rightly so, but if you're communicating the significance of these discoveries to a wider audience, you do slip into more heavily rhetorical and often spiritually freighted language.
And is what is making AI so scary right now for many people the idea that AI can talk and create? And is that what is so terrifying? Because we're fine kind of with a robot beating Garry Kasparov at a game. Where we start to get a bit scared is when it can do the things that we think only humans can do.
I think that's exactly right, actually. I think it's that sense of, hang on a second, we owned the kingdom of language up until now. What are you guys coming along and invading? And, okay, when it invades with language that sounds really kind of creaky and wooden and is grammatically a bit cumbersome and it's obviously coming from some artificial voice box, okay, fine, you think you can speak, but it's a pale imitation of the real thing. Then if you start communicating with AI in a way that you can't tell whether it's AI, and that, of course, is the foundation of the famous Turing test or the imitation game. All of a sudden, we feel a bit kind of threatened because we thought we owned this territory, and B, we feel threatened in a different way because all of a sudden, wow, it becomes really, really easy to deceive us. So I think that does stoke our insecurities quite a bit.
It does a bit. I am not convinced myself. Look at myself at the moment. I am a bit terrified, I guess, at the prospect. And you start to unpack this quite a lot in the chapter on AI, the implications for the future of humanity, but also the religious and theological ideas that are thrown into question. What has AI got to do with religion? And is it, as The Atlantic asked in 2017, a threat to Christianity? Big question there.
Well, I don't think it's a threat to Christianity. That's a kind of classic provocation question. I mean, you do occasionally get these churches of AI. They never last very long, really, and they're not anything serious as a threat like that. In terms of what AI has to do with religion, I guess the path of thinking is, again, through the human. And this is, I think, one of those instances where the role of the human in this discussion is most clearly evident. I want to know how I treat an AI. Well, in that case, I need to know what it's capable of and how that compares to the capacities of other things that I treat in certain ways. Can an AI do what a person does? And if so, do I need to treat it as a person? Does AI deserve rights? Well, personhood actually is a profoundly theological concept. It passed into our kind of ethical vocabulary originally from the Christological debates in the 4th century. So there were very, very deep theological roots to it. But in this instance, I think that the link, or rather the misstep we take, is that, well, humans are rational beings. Rationality is, we now know, a matter of processing information. AI can process information faster and better than we can. Therefore, AI is more rational than we are. Therefore, AI is more human than we are. And I think the problem with that entire argument is that it misses out the body. We are clever, we're rational up to a point, but we're embodied, vulnerable, contingent, frail, dependent beings who have goods in this material world that we want to pursue and bads that we want to avoid. And it seems to me that is the dimension that is missing through so much of the debate around, the future of what AI will become. Actually, I'm not, in principle, opposed to the idea that we might need to recognise the personhood of AI at some point in the future. But it's not when it becomes so super clever it can process whatever information even faster than it can at the moment. It's when it becomes the kind of creature that needs to source its own energy supply and dispose of its own waste, and perhaps collaborate with other creatures in an attempt to do so and defend itself or themselves from other creatures that might want to take those limited resources before they do. In other words, when it starts thinking and behaving and acting exactly the same way as humans have.
Well, try not to be absolutely terrified by this all, but I guess part of the point you're raising is it is about vulnerability, interdependence, and also it's about whether or not AI is a person. It's how we respond to whatever it is that AI is. Is that part of...
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way of putting it. And actually, one of the other interviews later on in the series is with Eve Poole, who's written a book on robot souls. I mean, I should say in advance that this whole series is an attempt to explore, initially through this conversation and then through some subsequent ones, the issues that we're talking about in Playing God. And she makes the point in her book that actually one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of people do we want to be in our treatment of AI? There's a great parallel here with the attitude to non-human animals. There we go again. In the 17th century, René Descartes famously suggested that the difference between humans and non-humans was the existence of the soul. Non-human animals not having a soul meant that they also didn't feel or think in the way that humans were. So that when you kicked a dog, and this is a genuine example, it made a whimpering, whining noise, but that was about as morally or existentially significant as when you pressed a certain button on a church organ and it made a certain noise. So it used to be said you could tell a good Cartesian by whether they would kick their dog in public or not. Well, we don't need to be the kind of people that kick dogs. And irrespective of what you think of dogs, you don't want to be the kind of person that visibly kicks a dog or invisibly kicks a dog. Ditto AI. So I think there's an important precautionary principle that we can apply to this.
So we've talked about the sad case of happy, and now let's move to the sad case of sadness, depression, mental health. It's been widely reported that in Western countries, there's a mental health crisis. Mental health issues are on the rise. People like me who run religion think tanks might be tempted to therefore highlight the studies that religion is good for people, that religious people face higher levels of mental well-being. But you're not so sure that's a straightforward fact, are you? Or at least part of what I think you're saying in the book is that it's more complicated than that.
So one of the most robust findings from this kind of research around the world is that there is a positive correlation between religion and well-being. But a few years ago at Theos, we went into that in a bit more detail to try and tease apart, what does religion mean and what does well-being mean? Because they're both pretty capacious, sprawling terms. Simply calling yourself religious is to not have much of a positive correlation, as you would expect. But doing religious stuff, and in particular, assembling, associating, singing, gathering together, and also personal religious practices, whether that's praying or fasting, those kind of things, are also positively correlated. So it's not so much simply a question of whether you consider yourself to be religious or even very religious. It's going to have an impact on your well-being. It's more to do with the habits and practices you form in the light of that. And there's an important PS to this. This isn't an instrumental thing. So you don't think, I'm going to become religious because I want better well-being, because that really gets the cart before the horse. There has to be, as it were, a sense of authenticity in all this.
So tell us a bit about why you included the mental health chapter in the book. Where is the overlapping bit between science and religion when it comes to mental health, would you say, and about what we understand about the human being?
I mean, it's a fascinating issue, and obviously it's a very, very important issue at the moment. This book is about the pharmacological turn towards understanding mental health. So the discovery of SSRIs in the 90s, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the way we treat mental health took a significant pharmacological turn, whereby we thought we better understood mental ill health neurologically, chemically, we can treat it as such. And accordingly, the level of antidepressant prescription just skyrocketed through the 90s and the noughties. Now, first thing first is that A, we're not entirely sure how it works. B, meta-studies on the impact of a lot of these drugs over the last 20 years or so show that actually the positive impact is pretty muted and in some cases simply non-existent. But thirdly, most importantly, this is a mapping issue, what we were talking about earlier. And it really came home to us when we looked at a paper published by the Office for National Statistics on the correlation between mental ill health and certain aspects of life. And right at the top, it had a big warning message saying, this paper looks at the correlation between the two. We don't want to suggest there is any causation there. But here's the thing. If you are unemployed, if you are a full-time unpaid carer, if you're bringing up kids by yourself, if you have long-term physical health problems, so on and so forth, you're more likely to suffer from mental ill health. If you have worries paying the heating at home, if you can't feed yourself, you don't have the money to pay the rent, you're more likely to report mental ill health. Now, I don't wish to undermine the ONS here, but I think there's probably some kind of causation going on here. But if you treat these things just as pharmacological problems, you don't get to the root of the issue. I'm still too poor to pay the rent, but here's some drugs. Is not a long-term solution. I can't get a job. I've been unemployed for 2 years or so, and I don't feel there's any worth or purpose to my life. Here are some SSRIs. That's not the solution. It might be a way of treating the immediate symptoms, but it doesn't engage with treating the deeper causes. It's a mapping issue. Do you understand the person in front of you as someone who has a neurochemical imbalance? Or do you understand them as someone who hasn't worked for 2 years and can't pay the rent? They can be both, and yet it is the latter humanistic understanding of the person that I think is ultimately the more important one.
And this touches on one of the things that you draw into the book, which is about politics, because science and religion aren't operating in a vacuum, are they? So the cost of living crisis or living in poverty or living in isolation, some of these situations that people find themselves in that might lead to particular poor mental well-being might be a result of political decisions. I was really interested that you brought politics into it. What role does politics play in all of these discussions?
There is obviously a political dimension to our understanding of the human genome and the extent to which we regulate our modification of it. There should be a political dimension to how we regulate AI, or what we do in terms of radical life extension therapy, that kind of thing. But the chapter that most focuses on politics, or rather most brings it to the forefront, is the one about anti-vaxxers. And the basis of that is that, rather depressingly for people like you and me, the data show there's a correlation between being religious, being Christian and being an anti-vaxxer. Now, that's the moment you put your head in your hands and you think, it's truth, our job is hard enough as it is. But actually, further studies show that it's not simple as that. It's not even a correlation between being a fundamentalist and being an anti-vaxxer. The strongest correlation is on people's political theology and whether they're an anti-vaxxer or not. By which I mean, if you have a certain view of the state, which basically says the state should just back off, if you're a libertarian who roots their libertarianism in Christianity, there is a strong correlation that you will be an anti-vaxxer as well, because from your mentality, the state is imposing something on me. It's wanting to put something in my body. Interestingly, there's another political position right at the other end of the spectrum, which is sometimes called Christian nationalism, which doesn't have the view that the state should just back out. It actually has a very high view of the state. God calls the state to do God's work, but it's failing in doing that. It's failing to meet the standards that God is calling it to, and therefore we should not trust it. And so Christian nationalists in the US are more likely to be anti-vaxxers. And actually that is also a position that you sometimes see replicated in the Orthodox world. This is a peripheral issue. I've tried to emphasise this in other interviews. We're not talking about many people here, but when you're talking about mass vaccination programmes, you don't need to be talking about many people. And so that chapter is called in a very tongue-in-cheek way, how we need political theology to save the world. Because if there is another pandemic coming, and the forecast said that there's a strong chance there will be in a few generations' time, it's not enough to say to people, these anti-vaxxers, they're idiots. You've got to understand why they're rejecting it and then appeal to them in the terms in which they have rejected it.
Well, I found the anti-vax chapter so interesting, partly because it does what you do throughout the book, which is draw together and chart the history of some of these ideas and these kind of conversations, connecting the past to the present. And I was really interested by how the anti-vax movement, something I think of as kind of very much of the COVID pandemic, is one area in which religion and science have long been in conversation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the myth of the warfare of science and religion was down to a couple of books published in the late 19th century that took the tension that there was underway at the time and used that as a lens through which to view the entirety of the history of the two. And when they did so, they looked at some of the opposition to early suggestions for vaccination, both in the US and indeed in the UK, beginning probably in the 1720s, I think, and then a bit more 18th century. And often they were religious figures who stood up and said, this is ungodly. And again, you kind of put your head in your hands and you think, oh no, here we go, this is religious people opposing progress again. But there are two really important caveats to note to that particular point. The first is that there were also quite a few prominent religious figures who said we should be vaccinated. But secondly, vaccination is a really counterintuitive thing to do. I mean, I say at one point in the book, you don't by and large indemnify people from drowning by pouring water down their throat until they gag. You don't protect somebody from burning to death by incinerating one of their fingers. So on the surface of it, the idea of protecting someone from a serious infection by giving them a little bit of that virus seems to me absolutely potty. And when you pair that with some of the really rather medically unethical ways that this was experimented on, first of all, basically getting poorer people or children, rubbing the vaccine into them and seeing how it worked, it's not entirely surprising that a lot of early advocates said this is unnatural and it's wicked. Now, they were wrong, and we now know they were wrong, but I'm inclined to accord figures from history more slack than we are inclined to these days. And I think in that instance, I don't find 18th century anti-vaxxers as worrying or problematic as 21st century anti-vaxxers.
Well, just to give you a little warning, I'm coming on to the abortion question now, because in America we see one of the most heated intersections of politics, science and religion being abortion. And you write this at the start of a chapter on that subject. Why would you do it? Why would you write a book that ranged from aliens to AI, from scientific immortality to animal personhood, all with the intention of steering the encounter between science and religion away from cantankerous discord and towards fruitful dialogue, only to include a chapter on abortion? And my question is, yes, well, why would you?
We thought long and hard about including it for exactly this reason, not least seeing as you don't want everyone to kind of view the entire book through this one particular chapter. We hope we've engaged in it in a way that's thoughtful and reasonable and sort of inclusive and not kind of culture war-y. But also, I suppose we included it precisely because we were worried about including it, if I can put it that way. And I kind of have a background philosophy that if someone is kind of standing over you saying, oh, you really shouldn't do that, maybe actually that's something you should do. Because if, in all seriousness, if people who want to have a thoughtful, reasonable conversation about this are scared off, the only people left are those who are shouting at one another, and we're not into that. The more specific medical reason were that the advances in understanding pregnancy and literally seeing the unborn child, and in some instances being able to operate on the unborn child, are quite extraordinary. I didn't know this at all before writing the book, but examples of conducting brain surgery on unborn children is absolutely breathtaking. But that feels like it changes the ethical framing a bit, because one of the reasons why this has been such an issue in the past is because fetuses are not seen. They don't feel to be quite part of the full human community. And yet in a hospital now, when you have one part of the hospital conducting abortions, another part of the hospital conducting brain surgery in unborn children. That feels a bit at odds. And there is another issue here, which is that an intellectual hero of mine, Amartya Sen, the Indian Nobel Prize-winning economist, has written about how there are an estimated missing 190 million girls and women in the world today. And they're missing for various reasons. They're partly missing because in some cultures they don't get as serious kind of attention to nourishment and food as boys do. In some cultures, it's because there's a social pressure to commit infanticide on girls. And in some cultures, because there is such a thing as sex-specific abortion. And there is some evidence, although it's very patchy, that that might be increasingly the case over here. But here's the thing. If you say that this matter is simply decided by choice, then it's within someone's right to choose whether they carry a boy or a girl. And I am very uneasy with that. And I know many feminists who are very uneasy with that. And I think, again, shying away from this question doesn't do it any good. So that we don't come in out really, really hard and certainly not tub thumping on this issue. We're certainly on the pro-life side of the divide. There's no doubt about that. But we do try and problematise both the key terms in this debate, choice and life, in a hope, perhaps a vain hope, but a hope that we can have a more profitable conversation about what is a very important issue.
So is the point of that chapter to be able to be civil about both sides?
So certainly that. I'll leave others to judge whether we've been successful, but we hope, we have represented positions that we might have disagreed with fairly and honestly. I mean, the point of the chapter is not to come up with answers. In fact, we emphasise this right at the beginning of the book and indeed throughout. This is not as if science has developed all these issues and here is religion to answer the questions. I mean, as a religious thinker, I find that view pretty obnoxious and unconvincing, and I'm sure non-religious thinkers think even more so. These are not the kind of questions that are solved in the same way as a mathematical or indeed a scientific problem might be solved. They're the kind of questions that provoke us to draw on our deepest understanding of human nature and human good, a conversation that I think the Christian faith, along with other worldviews, has a significant and important role to play. And that was as much the guiding light of that particular chapter as in all the others.
Well, as we move from abortion and start to draw our conversation to a close, let's talk a little bit about ends. Some of the ways in which we might assess whether or not a particular scientific advancement, let's say robot carers or gene editing, that requires biowarfare resistant soldiers. Some of what you say is it's really about the context in which these advancements take place. And ultimately, what is it that we believe humans are for? What is the end that we're heading towards? Is science simply unable to help us with the why and what questions of human personhood? So it's unable to answer the ends question. And perhaps if not science, then why not philosophy or sociology or history rather than religion?
So the first part of that question is quite easy. No, it can't. And it almost can't because of its foundation documents, the work of Francis Bacon in the early 17th century. And he, like other thinkers, are rebelling against Aristotle. And Aristotle has 4 explanations for why things happen, 4 causes. There's the material cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, and a final cause. I mean, the final cause is the thing of ends. So something is made, the cause of something is its ends. So the cause of a table, the final cause might be to eat upon it. Now, Bacon didn't like this. He said science really should be only interested in efficient causes and maybe material causes. In other words, you bracket out teleology, ends, from science. And it worked. Of course, science has been fantastically earth-transformingly successful in the intervening period, but it has done so precisely by bracketing out questions of ends. Now, that doesn't mean questions of ends are not significant. They're always been significant. They can only be answered by those disciplines that are much more normative, that are kind of value-laden. This is a religious response, but it's also, as you say, a philosophical response. When it comes to questions of human modification, particularly with regards to the genome, well, you invite the question, what are we doing this for? So to give 3 very brief examples, very few people would argue that you shouldn't use genetic engineering to correct definable bads. So things like Huntington's disease or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, those causes that might be monogenetic and seem to be able to be treated by some sort of genetic correction. That's straightforward because we know what the good we're looking for there or the bad we're trying to avoid. Okay, what about blindness or deafness? Now, there's no question that sight is a good, hearing is a good, and many people who lack both would prefer to have both. But that isn't to say that if you are blind or you're deaf, you're in any way less of a human being, or that you can't live a fully participatory and contributive life. And in any case, what is perfect eyesight? Because about 75% of the population wear corrective glasses or have had surgery. So modification there becomes a little bit more questionable. And then right at the other end of the spectrum, well, what if we can, and we definitely can't at the moment, possibly we never will be able to, but what if we could genetically treat things like intelligence, to improve people's intelligence, to lift them, as is the implication in Clara and the Sun Ishiguro's book? Well, intelligence is a good. Let's not beat about the bush about that. But is it the kind of good you want to pursue genetically? Those kind of questions can only be answered by saying, well, what are you trying to achieve here? What kind of human are you trying to make? What about society's responsibilities of welcoming and adapting in order to accommodate people who are different? These are normative teleological questions. But your question, why can't it be answered by philosophy? It can. Absolutely can. And there'll be plenty of philosophical positions and non-religious positions that come up with answers to that. And I have no problem with that at all. This is not an exclusively religious area, but it is historically one in which religious thought has operated. And I think it's one in which it has a lot to say in the future.
Well, final question then. What does Christianity say about what humans are for? I know that what do we mean by Christianity? What form of Christianity in which period? What denomination? But generally, what does Christianity say about what humans are for? And if you could wrap this up into the question, what does all of this tell us about humanity?
Well, as you know, I've not so long ago finished a PhD which touches on this question, and that is at least 120,000 words long, so we could be here for a lot longer, but I will be succinct. Humans are for gift. We are for giving ourselves to the other and for receiving the other as gift, receiving the other graciously as a gift to ourselves. I think that is a theme that unlocks the particular Christian doctrine of creation. I think it unlocks the doctrine of the incarnation. I think it's absolutely central to the idea of the crucifixion and salvation and atonement. There's lots of long Latin words there. I think they're all more pithily summed up by the idea of gift, which also then is a very neat link to our approach to Christian ethics, which is, again, how do you live? We should live as gifts to one another and accept one another as gifts to us.
Well, I am in no way biased, but it is an absolutely fascinating and excellent book. Playing God, Science, Religion and the Future of Humanity is published by SPCK and is written by Dr. Nick Spencer and Dr. Hannah Waite and is available now. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you. Next week, I'll be back in the interviewer's seat and talking to Andrew Davison about his book, Astrobiology and Christian Doctrine.
And there's a French theologian from the earlier 20th century who says, oh, well, it can't be that we're the only life in the universe because that would make the plinth too big for the statue. That theologian is wrong. That human life, with our capacity for relationships with one another, with God, acts of great selflessness and moral excellence and so on, for all of that, for the string quartets of Beethoven, for family life, for the fun of walking in the hills, the whole universe is not too big a plinth for that statue.
You've been listening to Reading Our Times from the think tank Theos. It's produced by Phil Bodger. Our team includes Daniel Turner, Fiona Hanscom and Chine McDonald. Special thanks to Nina Humphreys, who composed our theme tune and all the music. You can subscribe to Reading Our Times on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and you can also find us on the website theosthinktank.co.uk. We're going to be doing a few live events at festivals in the coming months, so please sign up to the Theos monthly newsletter and join us in person for those if you can. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast on iTunes. It'll help other people find it. Goodbye.